Now the goal here is to actually show some different vendor switches, the different ways they get configured, just to give you a better understanding of how you assign different VLANs to different ports and so on, like I was just previously explaining. So I'm actually going to start with this one. It's a pretty old switch, to be honest. You won't be able to get this particular one. It's by Cisco. It's an SLM 2008 8-port switch, but they don't make it anymore. But they do still make this sort of like range, which are small business, home office user range. So it's kind of like around the retail range of switch. It's not, one of these big, 10,000, 30 odd thousand plus switches that big businesses use. Although I do actually configure those as part of my job. No, this is more of a retail switch. So you've got this web GUI, and in this particular case, well, it's pretty easy to set up, to be honest. Hence why I wanted to use this one in particular. But it's a case of here, it's got a little section there which says VLAN, and then by default it just, if you click that, drops down the box, and then we go to this setting here, which is VLAN settings. So you can see that at the moment all it knows about is VLAN number 1. If we go a bit further down to the VLAN port settings, you can see these are all the ports, and there's the PVIDs that I was talking about. So at the moment, all of these ports are in actual VLAN number 1. So what we've got to actually do is, well, first step is we've actually got to create our VLAN. So in my example, I've got to create a VLAN 100. And now it's actually straight away in this particular switch instance, it's actually asking me, well, which ports do I want to assign VLAN 100 to, which is quite useful. Now, one thing to bear in mind is not all vendors will do that. Another thing to bear in mind is you don't want to lock yourself out of the switch. So I'm actually connected into port 8 on this switch. So I'm not going to go anywhere near port 8 at this stage. So it's going to stay in VLAN 1. But let's say VLAN 100, as far as I recall, that needs to be on port 2 and port 3. So you can see, like I was saying, you're on the VLAN and you just select which particular ports it applies to. So I'll just click Save. And then I'll create another VLAN, which is VLAN 200. Click Add, and again, it's straight in there and it's saying, oh, well, which ports do you want to apply it to? So that was going to be for port 1 and port 3. So click Save. Now, once these have now been created, that's pretty much it as far as the VLANs. But what I can do is, in other switches, other vendors, you would actually then go to the next step of assigning those. In this case, it did it automatically. But what you could do, for example, is select VLAN 100 here, click on Modify, and then here you actually decide, which ports we assign VLAN 100 to. But that's pretty much it as far as the VLANs go. We've created the VLANs and we've assigned them to the ports, but we've then got this section here, which is the VLAN port settings. So you can see that these have got drop down boxes against what's called the PVID column. So we've got all these different ports. We're not too concerned about this sort of stuff, but it's a case of we need to make some slight changes here. We need to start pinning specific interfaces down a specific VLAN. So port 1 would have been the PC, so that would belong to VLAN 200. And you can see we're only getting the choice of VLAN 1 and 200. So we select 200, then we click Save. Now port 3 is the firewall, so I'm not going to touch that yet. But if we go to port 2, that one is going to be 100. So now straight away, if I did actually have some computers plugged into this, the PC, if it was plugged into port 1, it would be on VLAN 200 now, and that's it. The laptop, which is on port 2, would be on VLAN 100. Now, the firewall, which we had on VLAN 100 and VLAN 200 and connected into port 3, as long as that was configured, it'll be functioning perfectly fine. The only thing is, it's the fact that it's got access to VLAN 1. That's the default VLAN, the native VLAN, or the PVID, the primary VLAN ID if you want, and we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up with some random number. Hang on, I didn't want to do that. I'll just go back and save it. Right, I'll create some other VLAN that I'm not going to use. So I'm going to use VLAN 3000 and see if this switch will allow that. Yeah, it will. Right, so I'm going to assign VLAN 3000 to port 3, which is where the firewall is at. So that's now been assigned. If I now go to the VLAN port settings again, what I can do is I can set that one to have a default VLAN basically of 3000. Now that VLAN isn't used anywhere else on this switch. So if for whatever reason the firewall did send any untagged traffic to the switch, then the switch is just going to, you know, put it into VLAN 3000, but there's nothing to communicate with on 3000. If someone comes along and plugs a computer into one of these other ports here, which is on VLAN 1, well, that traffic would have been tagged as VLAN 3000, whereas this is getting tagged as 1, so it's not, you know, it's not able to communicate with anything. Like I say, I mean, there are much bigger problems if the firewall got hacked and somebody started playing around with it. But in this particular case, it's just sort of like a best practice to stay away from VLAN 1 and to stay away from untagged packets. The only thing is, though, is that these ports, they still have the potential to support VLAN 1. So we'll see if the switch will let us do it, but I want to take VLAN 1 away from those ports. So yeah, it depends on the vendor. Now, in this particular case, this is being happy enough to let us do that. So if I go back to these ports, it's still saying it's VLAN 1, interestingly enough. So as I said, it seems to vary depending on the vendor. So it's not actually allowed on the VLAN, which is quite interesting. Sorry, the VLAN's not actually allowed on the port, but it's still giving us that option to set the PVU. Very odd. It's got to be a feature. Now, the one thing we also have to bear in mind is administration, because at this stage, our computers are connected to the relevant ports. I mean, if a computer plugged into port 1 just, you know, sends its traffic untagged, it's going to go straight into 200. The laptop plugged into port 2, it sends its traffic, it goes straight to 100. And the firewall's got access to effectively 100 and 200, because they would be the actual VLANs we would have configured on the actual firewall. But the one thing we've still got to do is actually, we've got to switch the actual switch itself over to a different management VLAN, because we really don't want to be using this VLAN. I mean, ideally we should even be changing these specific ports, but that's more of a security best practice, where we create another VLAN that's kind of assigned to unused ports, and then we change that so everything's in a completely different VLAN. So yeah, it's complicated. But anyway, the one thing we do want to do is we'll end up in a situation where there are no ports in VLAN 1, but our actual switch is still communicating on VLAN 1. And if we can't have a device on VLAN 1 to connect to the switch when its management interface is on VLAN 1, well, you get locked out. So what you have to do is actually go to the actual management settings. In this case, it's the admin tab. As far as I recall, oh no, it's not actually, it's the system tab. We go to system settings on this particular switch, and you'll see down here it's got a management VLAN of 1. So what we've got to do is we've actually got to change that management VLAN. If we've got to change the IP address to match the actual VLAN that we're using, you know, because chances are you'll move these devices around at different VLANs, and you'll end up changing the IP addressing in the process. You might end up having to change its IP address and its actual management VLAN, but it's just something to bear in mind, is that you don't want to end up in a situation where you just can't get access to this device because it's, well, yeah, it's trying to communicate on management VLAN 1. So that was the reason, for example, here where I'm coming in through, go back to my VLAN port settings. At the moment, I'm coming in through port number 8, and that's still assigned to VLAN 1. So until I change that port, I can always fall back to this VLAN 1 for this particular switch, but eventually all of these ports will get used up. So at some point I do have to actually get that switch off onto a different management VLAN, and then it would be a case of, right, in that case what I'll do is I'll find a port that's on the management VLAN that we're going to use. So it might be, say, VLAN 300 as our trusted network, our management network, whatever you want to call it. I would assign a port. So for example, port number 4 to this VLAN 300. And then what I would do is I would go to the switch and I'd change its management VLAN from 1 to 300. Now, as soon as I do that, I've locked myself out because my computer is connected to port number 8, which is VLAN 1, but the switch is only communicating on VLAN 300. So I'd have to repatch my computer into port number 4, which is now on 300, and then I'll be able to re-establish my connection. And then we'll come to this final switch port down here and put that into the relevant VLAN. Now, if at that stage you do need to change the IP addressing, that's fine. It doesn't really matter too much to the switch because your PC can be on a completely different IP address range to the rest of the VLAN. The switch doesn't care. It's just got an IP address in, well, you can't see that particular IP address because I've blocked it out. But it's a case of you would change this then to the relevant IP address range that suits this specific VLAN, VLAN 300 for instance. And that's pretty much it. You've changed all of the ports. All your VLANs are all now set up and the network's more secure. So the next switch we're going to do is a Netgear switch. Now this vendor switch here is going to be a lot more popular, particularly when it comes to the retail market, and that's Netgear. So this particular one, it's an 8-port gigabit switch, supports power over Ethernet, and this one I must admit has been extremely useful to me because I've been running quite a lot of what are effectively Raspberry Pis. I mean, I've built some Raspberry Pis and I've got some devices from manufacturers that are really just rebadged Raspberry Pis, and these have been getting used for my my smart home. So at the moment, it's powering these devices through power over an Ethernet, which means I just need to power the switch and then they power the Raspberry Pis, and it just saves me a lot on the needing electrical sockets. So it's great. But the plan is I'm just going to be replacing those with virtual machines instead. A lot more reliable doing it that way, because obviously if a computer breaks, well, that's it. I'm going to have to replace it at some point. So it's a lot easier to replace a virtual machine. But in any case, it's in production at the minute, and so there's only so much I can do, so much I can show you. But we're here on what is a switching tab, and then we go to a little mini tab, if you will, which is called VLAN, and it gives you a list of all the VLANs. So what we've got is, out of the box, we've got VLAN 1, 2 and 3. These are a default VLAN, a voice VLAN and an audio video VLAN. You can't delete them, you're stuck with them, that's it. So you can actually create your own VLANs. So for example, I can create VLAN 2000. I can give it a name, so I can call it my VLAN. It doesn't really matter in the sense that that name's only meaningful to you. All that really matters is the actual ID. So once I've put those details in, I mean, it gives me an actual drop down here for the type. And to be honest, I can't change it anyway. The ones that are built in are defaults, anything else is static. But once I put those details in, I'll just click on the add button. And there it goes, it creates my new VLAN. So once you've actually done that, I must admit, to me, it's not as intuitive as the Cisco one was. But what I've then got to do is then click on the advanced button to actually then start assigning the VLAN. So unlike the Cisco one, which automatically asked me, well, what do you want to assign this VLAN to? I've actually now got to go into this advanced tab. So we're still seeing, the list of VLANs here, but then I've got to go to the VLAN membership tab option here. And then I've then got to assign these VLANs. So here we are in the VLAN membership section, and it's here where we actually start to assign our VLAN to a specific port or multiple ports, depending on what we want to do with it. So unlike the Cisco Switch, which more or less brought us straight into this sort of question, really, the Netgear is getting you to step through things, manually. So what I've done is I've jumped ahead and I've selected VLAN 2000 from this drop-down box here. And I've done that because otherwise it'll show up all of the VLANs that are on this switch and I'll have to start editing them out. So it's a lot easier and it's going to save me a bit of hassle when it comes to editing the video, basically. But anyway, I've picked VLAN 2000 from the drop-down box, and what I've now got to do is actually somehow managed to click this little option here, and it expands this area out and shows us all of the ports. And these are all of the ports we can assign a VLAN to, all the ports that exist on this particular switch. And we've now got to actually make a decision as to, which of these ports are going to support this VLAN. So we've got choices. I mean, you can do group changes up here on this menu, or you can do individual selections. So for example, I mean, it's set at the moment at saying it's untag all, but if I click on tag all, it sets all of these ports up as tagged ports. If I select untag all, it sets all of the ports up as untagged ports. And if I click remove all, it just clears them all out. So obviously when we're starting with a completely new VLAN, it's not assigned to any of these boxes at all, or any of these ports, so they're all looking empty. Now, if I want to assign a VLAN to a specific port, I'm basically going to click on the actual port, the little box, if you will, to allow that VLAN on the port. So if I click on the one like port 9, for instance, you can see it's shown a T, and that means tagged. What that means is we can allow VLAN 2000 to be used on port 9, but the device that's plugged in has to tag the actual traffic. It has to tell the actual switch that the traffic belongs to VLAN 2000 by tagging it. If I click the port again, it now says U, which means untagged. So in this particular case, the switch doesn't care now. Traffic's going to be arriving on the actual port, and we want it to be part of VLAN 2000 effectively. We're not expecting it to be, any tags or anything. We're actually expecting untagged traffic, so we've got to select the U option. Now, if I actually click it again, that just clears the actual port out, so the VLAN's no longer applied. So we've just got to think about, well, what is the end device? Do we expect tags? If we do, we click it once to say it's a tagged port. If we don't, we're just expecting untagged traffic. We click the box again, and now it says U. And that's it, basically. So you would assign that VLAN to whichever ports are there, and then you'd click the apply button. Now, in my case, the ports, these ports are getting used. I don't think 9 and 10 are, but I'm just going to play it safe here because it's a switch that's in use at the moment. So once you've actually made those changes, you then go back to this drop-down menu. You then pick your next VLAN, and you go through the same process of picking the ports out that the VLAN can be used on, specifying whether it's going to be a tagged port or an untagged port, and clicking apply, and you just keep repeating the process. Now, once we've actually assigned these VLANs to various ports, they're not actually getting used, to be honest. It's a case of, well, if it's an end device, it's sending untagged traffic. And that's a bit of a problem because everything's still in VLAN 1. So what we've got to do is move on to the next section. We've actually got to go to this one here, which is to change the PVID. So we click on that link there, and it gives us a list of all of the ports on the switch. Now, I don't know why we've got 2 columns for the PVID, but it is what it is, because if I click on, say, port 9, for example, it copies the existing information up to this section here, and this is where we start to make our changes. So let's say, for example, it's a port, it hasn't been touched, so it's in VLAN 1. Now, if this is an end device and it's not sending any tags at all, as far as the switch is concerned, this traffic belongs to VLAN 1. I mean, yeah, we've allowed VLAN 2000 on the port, but there's no tag, there's nothing to tell the actual switch what VLAN this traffic belongs to. So it's using this PVID to determine what VLAN the PC or whatever, the end device is. It's using that PVID setting to determine the VLAN that the computer's in. And we can influence that by making the change here. So as I say, if it's a PC, for example, and we want it to be in that VLAN 2000, we'd put in 2000. So like I said, I don't know why they've given us 2 columns, because until I click on apply, this entry down here is not going to change. It's still saying 1. It's going to keep saying 1 until I click apply. So I don't know why we've got 2000, up here and 1 up here when, yeah, I think it's a bit, well, it is what it is, basically. But anywho, the idea is it's an end device, so we have to force it into that specific VLAN. That's how we put the PC into a specific VLAN, by changing the PVID for that specific port. Now, if on the other hand it was the firewall and that supports multiple VLANs, then the interface would have been set up as a tagged interface, in which case that would already be working. We just want to go to this extra step. So for example, we'd have a VLAN 3000, for instance, that's not getting used on any port anywhere within our network, and we'd assign that as the primary VLAN ID, if you will. And that means that if the firewall does send untagged traffic, it'll get put into VLAN 3000. There's nothing on VLAN 3000, so effectively the traffic will be dropped. So that's just a security best practice. But once we've set up all of these PVIDs on each of our individual ports, that's it. We've actually configured the switch, and we've put all of our devices into specific VLANs. If it's a VLAN aware device, it'll be tagging the traffic. The switch will tag traffic when it sends it back. If on the hand, if it's a PC or a laptop or basically a VLAN unaware device, it'll be sending untagged traffic, and we'll have been forcing it into a specific VLAN by setting the appropriate PVID. So the next thing we would probably do here is to go back to the VLAN membership and start removing VLAN 1 from these interfaces, but I've already done that sort of example in the Cisco switches. It's pretty much the same here. The only thing we would want to do next is to actually change the management VLAN for this particular switch. Now, just like the previous Cisco switch, we've got one final task, which is to change the management VLAN ID for the switch. We don't want to be managing this through VLAN 1 anymore. We want it to be in a more secure network segment, whatever VLAN that happens to be for you. So let's say, for example, just like with the Cisco switch, we were going to put it into VLAN 300. Well, what we need to do is we need to come to this System tab, then to Management, and then to IP configuration. So it has the IP addressing information that you use to access the actual switch, but it's also got a little field here for the management VLAN ID. Now mine here, it isn't actually on one. I've just changed just for the sake of argument, but this is what it would look like from scratch. So it's a case of we need to change that, but we don't want to lock ourselves out of the switch, because as soon as we change this and click apply, that's it. If we don't have an actual port in that same VLAN, we won't be able to get access to the switch. So just like the Cisco switch, the idea would be, we pick up an actual management VLAN that we want to use. So maybe a trusted VLAN, a management VLAN, whatever that number that happens to be for you, that's what you want to use. So what you would do is create that VLAN. So like with the Cisco switch, for example, it could be like VLAN 300. We might configure port 4 to be in VLAN 300. In the meantime, our PC is actually plugged into, say, port number 8, which is still in VLAN 1. So while we're in VLAN 1, we've got direct access to the switch and we can manage it because, well, the management ID here is VLAN number 1. So what we want to do is we now want to change this. So we've got a port ready, which is in VLAN 300. So we change this to be 300. We click apply, and that's it. We've now been disconnected. We can't get access to this switch through this port. So it's just a matter of disconnecting the port from the switch, plugging it into port number 4, and now our PC is on the same VLAN. Now, one thing to bear in mind is you'll probably want your PC and your switch to be set up with static IP addressing. You could use, dynamic IP addressing, DHCP, if you want. If you've already got a DHCP server on the VLAN, it doesn't really matter. You've just got that extra challenge of then finding out, well, what's the actual IP address that's been assigned to that specific switch, because until you don't know what to connect to. So it's just something to bear in mind. It might be easier just to set it as a static IP address to begin with before you change it. And then once you've got the switch moved over to the VLAN, then you come back and you change the IP address to match whatever the IP address range is for that particular VLAN. Then, of course, you'd have to update your PC as well. And then, of course, you can do whatever you like with that port 8 taken out of VLAN 1, assign it to something else. But that's basically it. You've got to set up your VLANs, you've got to assign them to ports. Make sure that you're being very specific when it comes to ports that don't support tagging. That's your typical computer, laptop, and so on. They've got to be hard-coded, if you will, with a specific PVID, and it's It's done for security reasons as well, for the sake of being able to function. If it's a firewall, for example, that supports multiple VLANs, it's a tag port. So it's slightly different to how the Cisco Switch is done, but the principle is very, very much the same. Now, I was going to actually wrap up this video here and there, but I have now actually got another switch in the post. Now, I haven't actually touched this vendor. It's the first time I've going to be using this vendor. So I thought what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delay the video, and then that way I can actually show you this other switch, a completely different vendor that I haven't touched. Because the process should be pretty much the same as what we've done with the Cisco Switch and this Netgear Switch. And we can just literally go through it in this, together, where I find my way around that particular configuration. Because I'm totally expecting, pretty much the same process of being able to configure it. So, fingers crossed this thing's going to turn up on time, and I'll be able to finish the video. Well, my new switch has actually turned up, so I didn't waste much time getting it out of the box and plugging it in, and here we are, it's up and running already, and it was really quick, I must admit. I even managed to get it upgraded within just a few seconds, just a case of going to the upgrade tab. It says, oh, you got a new version available. It downloaded it, it updated it, it rebooted it, and just in a few seconds it was that quick. But anyhow, the reason I'm interested in this is because it's a 10 gig switch, and MicroTik, the manufacturer, seems to be very popular these days when it comes to 10 gig. The pricing these things at a pretty good price, I must admit. So it's a case of the Switch is a good value for money. I think the more pricier side of it is probably the network cards for the computers. I mean, you can get SFPs. This thing, it's actually got 24 port, 1 gig ports. So these are built-in copper ports. Now, these two ports here are called SFP plus ports. And what I can do is I can go and get some SFPs to plug into these ports, turn them into 10 gig ports, and they can be fiber, they can be copper, and I can get those, for reasonable cost. But I think it's the network cards that'll probably set me back a bit more. But the good thing about it is because it's got 24 ports, it means I can consolidate two switches together. And the reason I was particularly interested in is this is a good sort of like stepping stone for me for 10 gig, because I could actually use one of these SFP ports, plug in a NAS, for example, that's capable of 10 gig, and it means I can have quite a lot of concurrent sessions going on. I mean, each of these ports is capable of potentially 1 gig. They'll never really get to 1 gig, but it means that a NAS that's got a 10 gig port can service, a lot of concurrent sessions at 1 gig. So that's to me, as I say, it's a really good stepping stone to 10 gig. So I do like that. The ARPs seem to be becoming a lot more popular. But this particular one, it's what's called a cloud switch. So this one just runs what's called a Switch OS. So I went for this particular version because it's just a switch. You can get another version which is more expensive, and it runs what's called Router OS or Router OS, depending on how you want to pronounce that. I mean, you can actually boot it between the two operating systems, but the other one's just got a lot more flexibility in terms of, like, dynamic routing and so on. But it's a case of all I'm really interested in is a switch. I don't need any layer 3 stuff for this, for what I'm doing. So yeah, it saved me a bit of money, and it means I've got the potential to start going to 10 gig now. But anywho, I don't want to go into too much detail on this thing because I must admit, it's pretty straightforward to set up once you understand it. You can get a bit confused because I know that although they actually give you an actual example of how to do this, they've got wording that tells you to do this, and then they've got screenshots that show you to do something different. So it's a bit strange. So in our example, it's a case of we had a PC in port 1, and that needs access to 200, VLAN 200. We've got a laptop in port 2, and we want to put that into VLAN 100. And then we've got a firewall, which is in port 3. It needs access to both VLAN 100 and 200. So going through their example, it would be a case of, right, I need to set the default VLAN ID for port 1 to 200, for port 2 to 100. So this default VLAN ID, it's the same sort of thing as the primary VLAN ID on the other vendors. It means exactly the same, because basically what it means is when traffic comes into the port and it isn't tagged, which is what you'd expect on an end device like a computer, a laptop, PC, it's got no tagging, so the switch doesn't know what VLAN it belongs to, in which case we set this VLAN ID here, and then the switch tags it. Now, when it comes to a firewall or any device that's supporting multiple VLANs, it's a case of, well, technically we don't actually want untagged traffic. It's a bit of a security risk. So the common strategy is pick a VLAN that you don't use. It's not not going to get used on your network, and then it's a case of, here I've just picked 3000 out of the air. What will happen is if the firewall was to send traffic untagged, the switch would put it into VLAN 3000, but there's nothing else on the network in VLAN 3000, and so it will get dropped. So that's one strategy doing it. So going by their example, it's a case of, right, we come to this tab here, which is the VLAN tab, and we set our default VLAN ID depending on, for end devices, we set the specific VLAN. If it's a VLAN aware device or a trunk port, it's a case of you just pick some unused VLAN. And then they actually go to the VLANs tab. So we come over to the VLANs tab here, and this is where you actually create your VLANs and you assign the VLAN to whatever port it needs to be used on. So I ended up doing all this in advance. I thought it was just going to take me forever if I did it on the fly on the video, because I was running into problems straight away. It was just going to take me forever, as I'll show you in a minute. But the idea is this would have been my step 1 and 2. If you've seen the previous sections, it was a case of step 1 was create the VLANs, step 2 was assign the VLANs to the relevant ports, then step 3 was set the PVIDs basically. Now in their case it's set up the PVIDs or the default VLAN IDs, then you come here and do this, and then they've got an extra step, which is, well, actually go back to the VLAN tab and set the VLAN mode. And the wording says set it to strict, but the screenshots say set it to enabled, or at least they show you it's set to enabled. Now, what I would suggest is go with the wording. Forget about the pictures, go with the wording, because strict makes a lot more sense. Because what that does, it's the highest level of security. It's the same as what the other vendors would be doing anyway, where once you set that VLAN ID, that's the only VLAN ID it's going to accept. And in this particular case of Switch, what it's doing, it's enforcing these settings here. So if, for example, I've got a PC, by default, the actual setting's optional, but say I've got a PC and it's capable of VLANs. If we're using the optional setting, the PC can send any tag it likes, doesn't care, nothing's going to stop it. And it's got potentially access to, VLAN 100, for example. If we set it to strict, it's a case of, if the traffic's untagged, it would get set to 200 and it won't accept anything else, because if you look at the port, VLAN 200 is the only VLAN allowed on the port. So if the PC was to send any other traffic that was tagged, doesn't matter what the VLAN ID is, well, unless it's 200, I suppose, but it would send it for a different VLAN. In other words, the actual computer was trying to send traffic into a different VLAN. It was trying to access a VLAN it shouldn't have access to. That strict mode and these settings here, where I've got it specifically tagged to VLAN 200, would stop that from happening. So yeah, I mean the VLAN's a bit, not the VLAN, the example's pretty straightforward. A kind of an odd order, I must admit. I mean, it actually doesn't make any difference, because if you start filling these fields in and then you come to here, these VLANs don't already exist. You've still got to create all of these VLANs from scratch. The actual changes in these tabs are found are completely independent of each other. Interestingly enough, the changes don't even get applied, because if you look down here, it's saying pending changes, and it's giving me an option of discard changes or apply all. So you can discard the changes if you've changed your mind. So it hasn't actually committed to anything until I click that button, which is apply all. But if I click discard changes, it just undoes everything that's been set up here since the actual, configuration was saved. If I go over to the VLANs tab, all of this stays as is. So likewise, if I click discard changes here, it'll forget about all these VLANs and the port assignments. But the actual VLAN settings that I've got set up here are still intact. But again, it's ultimately, you've still got to click that apply all button if you want to save the changes, because while it's set like this, nothing's happening. We haven't changed anything in the switch behavior. So yeah, I mean, if you actually do follow their example, it is pretty straightforward. Just remember to set it to strict though on the VLAN mode. I mean, you can actually go one extra step further, because there's got this option here which is VLAN receive. Now this is what's called an access port, in that we only want this computer to be in VLAN 200. We only expect untagged traffic. So what we could do is go one step further and say, well, actually, I only want untagged traffic. And I could do that for both the computer and the laptop. Now the firewall, on the other hand, we expect tagged traffic. I don't want untagged traffic at all. So I could actually enforce that by saying, well, I'll only accept tagged traffic. I mean, technically that VLAN ID doesn't apply then. So it's either way, it's an extra level of security. It's something you would do on some of the higher level sort of switches, the bigger business professional switches I tend to use in my daily work, where with those you would set that as what's called an access port, in which case it doesn't accept any tagging, so the same as that. Whereas that, it's a trunk port, in which case we expect tagging, so it does accept tags. And then you enforce which specific VLANs you want, and similar to how you do it here. So this is accepting, VLAN 100 and 200 on the port. Now, part of the reason why I configured all of this in advance, because when I first tried to do it, I would say I was kind of pulling my hair out, but I don't really have that much left, quite frankly. But it's a case of, if I actually create a new VLAN, by default it's assigned to every port, and that was driving me nuts, because I'm now having to like deselect all of these ports, and it's like, this is going to take me forever if I do this. I mean, I only did 3 VLANs, and it took quite a long time to deselect every individual port that I didn't want the VLAN on. But fortunately, what I've found is it gives you this flexibility where you can do ranges. So, I mean, that's port 7, for example. So if I click port 7, you can see the tick. If I start to move to the right, it starts to fill things in. I mean, you can see there it starts with a VLAN ID of 0. So, I mean, I've obviously got to change it to something different, 250, for example. But what I can do now is, if I select that far end port, I can literally clear out the entire set of VLAN settings and then just set, specific ones individually. I can do ranges, so I could click that port and drag it all the way over to there, for example. And the way it's operating is basically, you click a port. If you move to the left, it'll start to fill in the ones on the left. And then once you've picked, your end points, your last port in the range, just leave go of the mouse, and that's it. It's now selected that entire range. If you want to go right, then we click the port and start moving to the right. So it's the same thing. It's until I leave go of the mouse, I haven't committed to anything. The only thing to bear in mind is, once you've made a decision on the direction you're going in, you're stuck there. So at the moment, as soon as I started to move right, I can't now start going to the left. I can just keep moving to the right. So that seems to be like an anchor point. And if you actually come back to that original port you click, it just basically does an undo. So that's very useful, I must admit. So yeah, that was doing these 3 VLANs was taking forever, because I was literally deselecting every single port. I didn't realize you could do this, and it was just sheer luck I found that out. Oh, incidentally, that's a feature I've found. I don't know whether it's the browser, the operating system, or what, but if the pointer changes from an arrow to a hand, all of a sudden, I mean, I'm not holding down the mouse button now, and it's just constantly, like, it's kind of stuck there, where it's letting me keep moving the mouse around, and it's not going to commit to anything until I click. Whereas normally it's a case of I've got to hold the mouse button down. So yeah, I don't know whether that's a feature of the mouse, the operating system, and the browser, or what. It's yeah, it's a bit weird that. We'll go out of the tab and try that again. It actually orders them automatically, by the way, if you didn't notice that. Another thing I've found is sometimes if I cut I've got choices where I can cut a VLAN out. If I cut that VLAN, it seems to remember it. So if I select, let's pick this one, for example. If I cut that one, let's say I do that. If I then try to insert a one, it actually reinserts the one that I cut. Now the trouble is, if I do another insert, it tries to add it again, which is a bit strange. Now if I go over to the VLAN tab and then back to the VLANs tab, if I then do an insert, it's forgot all about that, in which case I can now I'm starting from scratch again. So it's, yeah, it's interesting. But anyhow, the main thing is, yeah, there's just two tabs to do everything on, and it's giving you that extra level of security. But yeah, I mean, at least with those other two vendors, that was pretty much your only choice, I would imagine, because once you set which specific ports of VLANs allowed on, that's it. It just enforces that anyway. Whereas for whatever reason, they're giving this choice. By default, it's set to optional, which effectively turns that port into a sort of like a transit port for any VLAN effectively. So I would follow their example, just go with strict. Go with the wording, set that to strict, set the VLAN IDs as appropriate. If it's going to be untagged, tell it it's untagged. If it's going to be tagged, set it to tagged. Doesn't really make that much difference, I suppose, if you've already got some, dummy VLAN set up on a tag port. In this particular case, it wouldn't matter because for this port, because if somebody sent an actual packet that was tagged for VLAN 200, it would be accepted. If it was set for 100, it would be dropped. If it was unmarked, it would end up in 200. So it doesn't really matter whether that's set to any or only untagged, simply because the settings of I've got this particular VLAN ID and I'm strictly enforcing the actual port settings to say I can only allow that specific. Well, at least I did before. At least now it's going to enforce that. The only thing to bear in mind though is none of these changes are going to apply until I literally tell it to apply the changes. But that's quite useful, I must admit. I do like it. The one drawback I'd say to this particular one, I honestly, I don't know why, is that it's only allowing me access on HTTP. In Router OS or Route OS, as far as I'm aware, you can actually put a self-signed certificate on the actual box. With this Switch OS, I'm not seeing that as an option. If I go to the system, I can pin the actual VLAN for the management down. I can change the management IP. I mean, at the moment it's running on a dynamic IP address anyway. This is its default IP address out of the box. So if it doesn't get an IP address through DHCP, it'll actually it'll use this one. So I'm on a different network anyway, so it's a case of it's picking it up on DHCP. So I'm actually connecting it to it on something completely different. So it doesn't really matter. But I'm not seeing an option here to actually set the set it over to HTTPS. So I'm kind of stuck with a weak, management system where it's only allowing access through HTTP, which it's not too bad, I suppose, on a home network, because if everything's running through switches, you're okay. On a business network, that's a big no-no, because if somebody manages to tap into your network with a man-in-the-middle attack or something, then yeah, they'll have the potential to monitor traffic. Whereas in the house, it's a case of you've got much bigger problems if someone's been able to get a device onto your network in your house. I mean, chances are that they'll just probably stolen your devices anyway, quite frankly. Anywho, a MicroTik discovery protocol. I never noticed that. Anyhow, so yeah, I'd say it's pretty straightforward to set up, and it's like a good price range. So I'm quite impressed by that. I think I can see me buying some more of these at some point. But for now, that'll do. Just, one 10 gig port for a NAS. So if you're interested in this sort of switch, I'll leave a link for it as well as some details for it in the description box and what have you. I'll do the same for the Netgear one. That one you can still buy as well. That's pretty good if you're into like power over Ethernet and what have you. The Cisco one I was demoing, you can't buy that one anymore, so I won't be leaving a link for that. You can still buy like small office, home office switches from Cisco. I mean, they are pretty good ones. I do like them. That was the reason I specifically got that one. But for now, that one's just gone into the box because it's a case of, it's obsolete. It had the same problem where you can only access it through HTTP as well, but they've since come out with much newer ones because that one was really getting long in the tooth. But anywho, I think that pretty much covers it in terms of setting up VLANs and switches. So I hope I've made it clear enough as to what it is you need to do. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, because that encourages YouTube's algorithm to suggest it to other people who might find it useful as well. If you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yeah, do subscribe. Just remember to click the little bell icon though, that way you'll get notifications when I send new content out. If you've got any comments, any suggestions, if you want to leave any feedback at all, please post that in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, I've left links to both Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But above all, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.